So I've been very excited about this panel all year. And as I was speaking to one of our panelists, John Tanner, last night, I was just reminded of how few scholarly events or how few scholars work on Richard Brautigan's work or even talk about his work at all. And that was a pretty good reminder coming into today to really let it set in of like how significant for me personally, and I hope for you too, that this panel that we've assembled on Richard Brautigan is and is going to be in just a few minutes. When I first got assigned to this panel, one of the questions that I kept getting was, what I think is maybe a really common question when it comes to Richard Brautigan's work is, what is your connection to Richard Brautigan's work? How did you discover him? Like, what is it about? Where'd you discover him? These kinds of sort of almost stumbling questions of like, because maybe it's so surprising sometimes to meet another fan of his work, another lover of his work, but maybe also it's just like a really special moment when you meet somebody that's just like, oh yeah, you too, you fell for that too. It's really awesome. So it's led me to think a lot of like my own personal introduction, which is to his work, which is a lot less exciting than most of the stories that other people have who asked me this question. So again, I've been looking forward to this all year, and I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order that they'll be presenting. So first, from Santa Rosa, we have Ianthe Brautigan, who will be talking about her father and his work. And I just want to take a moment to recognize the insane tragedies that are happening in Santa Rosa right now. It's like fighting fires and apparently mostly contained, but still going to struggle for a while. So I just want to take a moment to remind us of that context in the world, especially because we here at SPLAB and in the Cascadia Poetry Festival, work so much on our connection to place and environment and the earth. And then our second panelist, Tod Marshall, down here at the end, is our resident Washington State Poet Laureate. Our third panelist, John Tanner, comes from very far away, 6,000 miles. He flew here to do this talk and to be a part of this, and probably to meet other people who are excited about Brautigan's work. And then we have Conrad, our favorite. Can we just adopt you as a Washington poet, our favorite adopted Washington poet to be here, C.A. Conrad. So now I'm just going to hand it over to everybody because you're really here to hear them talk.
So Nadine, if you could just give me like a 3-minute warning, because I'm going to go for about 10 minutes, I guess. Can you hear me? All right, can you hear me now? No. God bless the hearing. Can you hear me now? Kind of, sort of, got it? Okay, great. All right, so first I want to thank Paul Nelson and everybody here at the Cascadia Poetry Festival for hosting this beautiful event. It's been really lovely here last night, hearing the beautiful poetry, and then today that really powerful panel. And I'm also thrilled to be here with Tod Marshall and John Tanner and C.A. Conrad. And one of the things I want to say is that I was talking to my husband this morning, and I said, I think I'm at the 10th my father. And he said, you must be in heaven. Because I don't talk about my dad all the time. And very rarely do I get to be in the company of people who understand and have put thought into his work. So it's really a treat for me, and I wish, and I'm going to be kind of short because I'm really interested in what these people have to say. And if I had my way, I would be the moderator, Nadine. I realized that I was like, damn it, I missed an opportunity. So what I wanted to start out with is something that my father would appreciate, which is, this is what is in my purse, cat food, because we had to evacuate for a day, and we of course went with our cat, and then an apple because God forbid you should be hungry, and I have throat lozenges because we've been breathing smoke. So I was thinking about, what do you take from your home? And so I took this coat because it's brand new and I love it, and I didn't want it to burn up. And I took a box of things that were important for my father, and a Bruce Conner print, and the rest I was like, okay. I mean, don't get me wrong, it'd be very sad to lose our house, and I don't know where we would live, but I thought, well, okay, but it was kind of a short list of what I took. And what I want to do right now is I want to go back in time to Tacoma, Washington, because this is where my father lived as a child. And walking down the streets, I'm seeing these antique billboards, and I know that he probably read them, or he actually couldn't read till he was 6, so I don't know what he saw. And so this place was a place that informed who my father was. I was able to get for those of you who don't know, he was raised here. He moved to Eugene, Oregon, and then he discovered poetry in high school at the age of 17 and became a very serious poet at the age of 17. To look at those early papers, which he considers juvenilia, but he still, you see his hard work. And then he had a breakdown of some kind, because if you're a young man in a working class community and you say you're going to be a poet, they'll put you in a mental institution and give you shocks. The reason that he went to Salem State, the state asylum in Salem, was because he told the judge that he was going to be a famous writer one day. And then I got the medical notes, and they wrote, he keeps writing things down and saying, I don't want to forget, I don't want to forget. And he had a woman who helped him get out, and he came down to Northern California and met people like Michael McClure and Joanne Kiger and Leroy Jones, Baraka, his different name now, or he's now deceased, but he has a different name. And met Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Lou Welsh and Ron Lowenson and all these people, and was able to become a famous writer, which is kind of astonishing in my opinion. What's interesting about him, to me, as his daughter and reading all his work, is that he had a connection to the everyday. And there's a line in Trout Fishing, the Baudelaire poems, where he writes that the insane asylum is weaving around his feet like a cat. But he didn't tell anybody that he was in an insane asylum for 3 months. But the everyday and place. So I just wanted to read you just the beginning of All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, because he had this incredible relationship to nature, but a very practical relationship to it as well. So I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. And water, obviously, the Pacific Northwest. So this tie to the everyday is something that intrigues me, and as his daughter, it was living with somebody who saw the world in a different way, and not a fantastical Willy Wonka kind of way. He wasn't like this super califragilistic person, but he was somebody who was always embedded in the moment and in of the time. And I think his conflating the everyday and the sublime is the Xerox candy bar. Ah, you're just a copy of all the candy bars I've ever eaten. And then love becomes machines, or just the idea that machines could be lonely. This poem, San Francisco, this poem was found written on a paper bag by Richard Brautigan in a laundromat in San Francisco. The author is unknown. By accident, you put your money in my machine, number 4. By accident, I put my money in another machine, number 6. On purpose, I put your clothes in the empty machine full of water and no clothes. It was lonely. So when I think about him and his work, it's infused in place. It's infused up here, and I'm going to kind of wrap this up because I feel like we need to move on. And I will talk more someday on this. But I think to me, what makes his poetry so interesting is that I feel like, A, he wanted to write about the human condition, and he says that a couple of times. B, he was a poet of the 20th century. He didn't claim to march into the 21st century. And I don't know what the C is, because it would be, I should leave that for you to fill in. As to the Karma Repair Kit, which I've been thinking a lot about. So what I wanted to say is that 2 years ago, I thought that I would keep all his artifacts safe. So I put them in the Harper storage unit over in Coffey Park. And for those of you who don't know, Coffey Park was fucking flattened. It's gone. The Kmart across the street from Hopper Storage was melted to the ground. Applebee's, all these places. But guess what is still standing? The Hopper Storage Unit. And I talked to a fabulous millennial who was like, yeah, it's really okay. And I was like, and I thought, only my dad could survive. So I think people worry about, will he stay? And I think I think his words will always survive. But in that, those artifacts are Michael McClure. He was very good friends with Michael McClure. There are letters. What they did together with the Diggers was incredible. And I have the Digger papers. It's a lot of anti-war. A lot of anti-war materials. And you just see how active people were during that time, trying desperately to prevent killing. The Diggers were all about food. There's the free store. I don't know if you guys know the Diggers, but they was about, so you're nodding your heads. So those artifacts are there. So my husband is like, now will you get rid of them? And I'm like, yeah. They will go somewhere safer. But I wanted to, Joanne Kiger passed, and she said the most beautiful thing about that period of time where my dad was in North Beach, and you had Blabbermouth and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you know that reference, but you can look it up. But Joanne Kiger said that she had one pair of shoes, and everything was so busy, she would run up and down North Beach and have to get her shoes rehealed because something was happening all the time. And when Ken Kesey was being interviewed at one point, he said, write this down. And Ken Kesey, I love his work. God, I love his work. He said, when everyone, 500 years, when everyone's forgotten, you'll still remember Brautigan. And when I was reading those poems, you can hear his voice. He's immediate. He's right here. And I always like to imagine that some poor kid somewhere, is reading his work and saying, I can do that. I can do that. I can be part of poetry. And And I also want to say that whenever I go through times of trouble, and I'm not a woo-woo person, and if you are, hooray, I'm all for woo-woo, but I do feel him, and I felt him during this fire, being close, and there's one last poem, and which is Boo Forever, spinning like a ghost at the bottom of a top. So my dad, of course, at the bottom of a top. I am haunted by all the space that I will live without you.
So that would be me? Okay. So my name is Tod Marshall, and from 2016 to 2018, I've been serving as the Washington State Poet Laureate. The Poet Laureate program is sponsored by Humanities Washington and Arts Washington, and it exists to increase awareness and appreciation of poetry throughout the state. Those are two great organizations. If you're not familiar with them, check out their work, please. So I knew I was going to be here this morning on this panel with experts and Richard Brautigan's daughter, and so I wanted to talk about some things that drew me to Brautigan, some things that pushed me away, and share a few poems, and firmly deny any notion that I'm an expert on Brautigan's work. I would call myself an avid enthusiast, and I'll hopefully explain that in the remarks that I've prepared. Brautigan is, of course, a part of the literary landscape of the Pacific Northwest, the counterculture, and his work will continue to be discovered by new readers who will react to the magical surprise. And I saw you have magician as your first word, your first sentence there, and I was like, oh, it's the magical surprise, the resonant images, and the vivid defiance of expectation. Surrealism often seems to come up in critical discussions of Brautigan, and so let me evoke one of my favorite surrealist writers for a moment, Andre Breton. In Breton's book, Mad Love, he writes, quote, "Beauty will be convulsive, or not at all. Convulsive beauty will be veiled erotic, fixed explosive, magical circumstantial, or it will not be." Now, all three of these categories are fascinating to consider and would, I think, merit extended consideration in connection with Brautigan and his work. I'm not here to offer that today, only to offer those principles as exploratory ways for thinking about Brautigan, especially the latter two, fixed explosive and magical circumstantial, because I think eroticism was not something that Brautigan exerted too much energy toward veiling in his work. No, I hope instead just to offer those principles in connection with Brautigan, share a few poems, and ask a few questions. Psalm. A farmer in eastern Oregon saw Jesus in a chicken house. Jesus was standing there holding a basket of eggs. Jesus said, "I'm hungry." The farmer never told what he saw to anyone. I suppose that's a 1959 poem. I suppose that in some ways this talk begins for me by thinking about my first attraction, those first loves, those first energies that draw one to poetry, to painting, to the arts. I wish that I was smarter and better able to articulate this distinction, the distinction between the passions that we have, the enthusiasms that we have, versus the admiration that we cultivate later on in life. Maybe it has to do with schooling, maybe it has to do with the broadening of our aesthetics, maybe it has to do with a host of other cultural forces. I don't know for sure, but I do know that Richard Brautigan's poems were some of the first works that I read with excitement, that The Pill versus the Spring Hill Mine Disaster has so many poems in it that made me feel like I was discovering the world, discovering a world. I felt a keen vertigo reading them that comes over us when we're in the presence of great art. Here is a new way of seeing. The magic of the circumstances of my being in the world is spoken to by those poems. Although I'm not going to do more than mention the prose, Trout Fishing, Watermelon Sugar, Hawkline Monster, those were books that I carried around with me pretty much daily until in a creative writing class, and this would have been around 1986 in college, a professor called on me and asked me what poets, what writers I enjoyed, to which I responded enthusiastically, Richard Brautigan. He paused, looked amused, and then condescendingly said, we all go through a Brautigan phase. And in hindsight, I'm like, what a dick. I mean, that was just a horrible thing to say to anyone when they obviously had this amazing excitement. And so, the American submarine. I became aware of a loud and gradually increasing sound like the moaning of a vast herd of buffaloes upon an American prairie. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was an American submarine sailing beneath a herd of buffaloes. He torpedoed a maelstrom. It sank slowly into a drop of our past. And the buffaloes did not hear a sound. They continued grazing peacefully in Nebraska. Your departure versus the Hindenburg. Every time we say goodbye, I see it as an extension of the Hindenburg, that great 1937 airship exploding in medieval flames like a burning castle above New Jersey. When you leave the house, the shadow of the Hindenburg enters to take your place. Haiku ambulance. A piece of green pepper fell off the wooden salad bowl. So what? And I could be wrong here. Some of you might know the answer to this, but I think that is the poem of Brautigan's that I've encountered most in college textbooks, in the different anthologies. And I'd be curious to see if that's a completely wrong assumption on my part. An anonymous reviewer wrote, quote, "The poet's concerns, for the most part, trick the reader into seeing life afresh." I like the insight of that reviewer's comments on Brautigan, but I don't think the word trick is the best word there. I think that these poems embody, articulate, they're great examples of Breton's convulsive beauty. They're wonderful poems that estrange the familiar, that carry strong emotion, vivid seeing, the magic that allows us to see the circumstances of the world again. So when Paul informed me that I'd be participating in this panel, I did a survey in the Gonzaga English department. I asked if anyone taught Brautigan in classes. The sum total was 0. I began asking at other places that I visited, other colleges and high schools. The answer was almost unanimously no. Many had heard of Brautigan, which is sometimes no small thing. Many even could name books and individual poems. Many were fans of his work. Many would, on occasion, profess to loving trout fishing or hawkline or some certain poems, but none of the professors and teachers said that they regularly or even rarely taught a Brautigan poem in class, which of course sent me back to my undergraduate experience, which made me think about why that attitude might be the case. This is a poem by Carl Sandburg, Fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. This is a poem by Richard Brautigan called A Correction. Cats walk on little cat feet, and fogs walk on little fog feet. Carl, I love the Carl at the end. Humor is a hard pursuit for extended discussions. Explications and astonishment don't often go hand in hand. We murder, of course, to dissect. Surrealism, Dada, the witty and incisive and anti-art aspect of many beat writers often goes unremarked upon in class, or if remarked upon reveals itself to be unsuited to the usual practices and methodologies of how poetry is studied. I think, for example, of the disastrous classes I've had trying to incite, excite, elicit enthusiasm for John Cage, for Snyder's goofier poems and riprap, for Kerouac, how I read a Kiger poem at an event to great enthusiasm and then introduce it in a classroom setting and find it go flat. I think about how I've tried to get Waldman and Sanders on people's radar in classes, and I've just been met with indifference, which may all be my failure, which is probably my failure, which might speak to something about poetry and how we're taught to study it very early on in life, which might mean that convulsive beauty doesn't often reveal itself when students are watching clock hands tick-tick on the wall. I was enthusiastic to find, though, in gathering the poems for the Washington 129 anthology, that there were many poems in it that seemed to embody, to my mind, a kind of Brautigan-esque spirit, if you will, an attention to place and a certain humorous energy. And I wanted to share a couple of those before I wrap up my comments. This is by Christopher Luna, a poet down in Vancouver. From Ghost Town, USA, Mill Plain Boulevard and Andreessen Road. Upper middle class women and their mothers take Hummers to Safeway to pick up poinsettias and birthday cakes. You never know when you might encounter an Iraqi insurgent hiding in the dairy aisle or a tweaker with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. That's by Christopher Luna, a wonderful poetic energy down in Vancouver. Drinking Beer at the Goldendale Demolition Derby by Joanna Thomas, Goldendale, Washington, Monday, July 4th, 2016. Wop, wop, wop of flapjack tires. If you love it, lube it under the hood. A spark, then smoke, then oops. A flame, full-blown phoenix, rising orange, metal, wings. Hot, hot, 86 Pontiac Firebird. Get the hoses, boys, half-naked chick, yelling from the bleachers, her belly button, blue stars and stripes. Guy neck red next to me, his tremendous belch. Rainier erupting, and everywhere is dust. And then last, Anastasia Renee, a wonderful poet in Seattle. I love the humor in this poem, Bold. She says the mouse is domesticated because it comes out to eat when she is eating breakfast, sunny side up. Because it washes his hands and waits for her to say grace. Because it walks around each trap and avoids eating pellets. Because it knows when she is trying to kill it. Because it won't just die already like everyone else. Because it wants to live its life in her kitchen like she's all bright yellow and sunshine. And, in all three of those poems, and I think there are others in the book, it's fascinating that spirit of humor, that spirit of everydayness that you mentioned, I think comes forth. I've failed to mention Robert Sund, a poet in whom I see Brautigan and Buddha living side by side. I failed to say anything about Tom Robbins, with whom I had an engaging email exchange about Brautigan in this panel. I've failed to say much of anything about Brautigan's sentences, his genius use of metaphor, how he subverts conventions. I think that he was way ahead of time thinking about how we can appropriate literary conventions and do different things in them that are unexpected and really, kind of blow our readers' minds. There's a lot more to say, obviously, but perhaps I'll finish with another Breton quotation, one that the poet Claudia Keelan spoke to me, and one that I've tried unsuccessfully to track down, and so its attribution is apocryphal, but I kind of like that dynamic about it. He may have once written, quote, "Live every moment of your life as if you're falling in love." Brautigan's works were words that I fell in love with. I am glad for that, and I am glad to have had that love rekindled through his rereading his poems over the last 9 months. So, thank you. More magic.
More magic. Can you hear me? Good. Okay, I'm John Tanner, and as you'll know, even by these few words so far, I'm from the UK. I used to be a journalist for many years. Then I was a media executive. Then the media company decided that I wasn't going to be a media executive anymore. So I went back to university and became a sort of a poet and a sort of an academic. And those of you who know the media industry will know what a big move that is. I wrote my doctoral thesis on Richard Brautigan. Discovering him, I ignored him at 18, which is the age that people are supposed to discover Brautigan, but discovered him at age 56, 57, so a late piece of evangelic conversion. I've got a piece to read which is called Breaking Up and Making Up, which makes it sound as if I ought to be sort of breaking out into song, but not quite. It's about the way that Richard Brautigan uses fragmentation processes in his art and the effect that that has on it. And as Tod rightly says, a magician is in the first line. Richard Brautigan was a magician, and there are lots of ways to examine his magic in the hope of finding out how it works. This is one of them, just one. And its starting point is the 4th chapter of the Brautigan novel, Willard and His Bowling Trophies. The chapter features remnants of ancient Greek writing that come from poems whose full text is lost. They're like splinters from a vanished Greek frieze and had a great appeal for Brautigan. He passes that enthusiasm to one of the characters in Willard, a rather woeful figure called Bob. And in this passage that I'll read you, Bob's quoting these fragments to his wife. By the way, he's previously tied and gagged her as part of a sex game, so he's got what we would all wish for, a captive audience. These are just fragments, lines, he said, parts of lines, and sometimes only single words that remain from the original poems written by the Greeks thousands of years ago. More beautiful, Bob said. That's all that's left of a poem. Having fled, Bob said, that's all that's left of another. He cheats you, Bob said. Breaking. You have made me forget all my sorrows. There are 3 more. Here are 2 really beautiful ones, Bob said. Deeply do I mourn, for my friends are nothing worth. Takes bites of the cucumbers. What do you think? Do you like them? Bob said. He'd forgotten that she couldn't answer him. She nodded her head. Yes, she liked them. Would you like to hear some more? Bob said. He'd forgotten there was a gag in her mouth. She slowly nodded yes. Here are 4 more fragments, Bob said. They're all that remain of a man's voice from thousands of years ago. Storms of these I was. He understood. Incredible, huh? Fragments, broken things. Brautigan attributes them to a collection called the Greek Anthology, which he owned and admired. I found more than half of them not there, but in another related source. But editions of the anthology vary, no doubt, and what's important is not where Brautigan discovered the remnants, but what they meant to him and what relevance they have for his work. And I think the answer to the first question is that Brautigan saw that the fragments had replaced the lost meaning of the vanished poems with a new kind of meaning. They resonate through omission, through the haunting absences that surround them, through their teasing ambiguity, the myriad possibilities they conjure. And the relevance of this to Brautigan's work is that he creates a similar effect to that of the Greek remnants. He does it through an aesthetic of fragmentation. It's part of what makes him a great American original. To see this strategy in action, let's look at one of Brautigan's short stories. It's called September, California. 22nd September means that she is lying on the beach in a black bathing suit, and she is very carefully taking her own temperature. She's beautiful, long and white, and obviously a secretary from Montgomery Street who went to San Jose State College for 3 years, and this is not the first time that she has taken her own temperature in a black bathing suit at the beach. She seems to be enjoying herself, and I can't take my eyes off her. Beyond the thermometer is a ship passing out of San Francisco Bay, bound for cities on the other side of the world, those places. Her hair is the same color as the ship, I can almost see the captain. He's saying something to one of the crew. Now she takes the thermometer out of her mouth, looks at it, smiles. Everything is all right, and puts it away in a little lilac carry case. The sailor does not understand what the captain said, so the captain has to repeat it. There's a compelling strangeness to this piece, one that increases the more attention you pay to it. Take the conversation on the ship. The narrator says that he can almost see the captain. But if you almost see something, you haven't seen it at all. The captain, the sailor, and the exchange between them are in the narrator's imagination. Neither can I see any narrative or thematic connection between the ship and the woman on the beach, other than that both are made mysterious. The two scenes are placed in a surreal juxtaposition, like the incongruous combinations in a Salvador Dali painting, or in some collages by Braque and Picasso. Then there's the problem of the woman's hair. It's said to be the same color as the ship, but the narrator doesn't actually tell us the color of the ship. Two absences are being compared. So even with such a simple piece of information as hair color, a carefully created fracture of meaning is placed in the heart of the text. You can find smaller fractures from the outset. In the opening sentence, there's a puzzling choice of word which creates a minor non sequitur. We're told that 22nd September means that this woman is on the beach. Now, means is a word we use when a date and an event are unbreakably synonymous, as in 25th December means that it's Christmas Day. I doubt the woman's presence has that level of inevitability. Yet Brautigan was very careful about words. He hasn't unwittingly made an inappropriate choice yet. More striking is the curious use of the word obviously at the beginning of the brief account of the woman's education and employment. It suggests that the details are clear to any watcher, but obviously that can't be true. How could anyone guess them? Come to that, how does the narrator know the details? He says that he can't take his eyes off the woman, but avoids telling us if she is stranger, friend, wife, lover. Also, why is the woman taking her temperature? The activity seems important, possibly she's pregnant, but the narrator either can't or won't explain. Another omission, another gap in meaning. Incidentally, as I'm sure some of you know, Brautigan takes this strategy of omission much, much further in a couple of poems. He gives us titles, but no text. So we see that through omission, contradiction, non sequitur, and a surreal mixing of the possibly real with the clearly imaginary, fractures of meaning appear, and it's harder to make full sense of the piece. Subtly and through design, not accident, Brautigan simulates the Greek fragments. One kind of meaning is lost, but something new and appealing comes from that loss. Note as well that there's no sustained narrative in September, California, and nothing within it is fully resolved. What's the captain saying? Will his repetition of it be understood? If not, what will be the consequences? What is the condition that the woman is monitoring? And will things still be all right the next time she checks? Brautigan frequently denies us closure, one of the many ways in which his work subverts or openly mocks the traditional conventions of literature. For instance, in the novel A Confederate General from Big Sur, Brautigan tells us that the story has no single conclusion. First, he offers alternative endings. Then he tells us that the story is generating contradictory endings at the speed of light. reminding us of the countless narratives that the Greek fragments can generate. September California isn't moving at the speed of light. In fact, although movement is indicated, the piece feels more like a freeze frame, or more accurately, two freeze frames spliced together, ship and captain, woman and thermometer, each cut from an unknown film, or from different films. In trout fishing in America, Brautigan gathers together scores of fragments like these in a collage structure. The book was published as a novel, but it has none of the elements that traditionally characterize novels. Jack Spicer, Brautigan's friend and mentor, didn't see it as a novel, didn't even think of it as prose. He called it a poem. Michael McClure goes further. He said that he prefers not to think of Brautigan as a novelist at all, but as a creator of extended prose poems. As often as not, Brautigan seems to ignore whatever boundaries may be thought to exist between the two. September California is a typical example. It appears in a book, Revenge of the Lawn, which is a collection of Brautigan's short stories. So nominally it's a work of prose, but it lacks the content conventionally expected in a short story. Although it's laid out on the page in prose format, it has many characteristics that you'd associate with poetry. It has the flow and feel of a poem. Unlike many Japanese haiku, it has a compressed, neutral-voiced focus on details. It's got a brevity we associate with verse rather than prose fiction. And because of that brevity, it's adrift in white space on the page, drawing attention to the unexpected absence surrounding it. An awareness of the way the text interacts with the white field in which it appears is characteristic of Brautigan. It goes back even to his juvenilia, where at least two short stories are displayed with only one line or one sentence per page. It's a tactic more associated with a poetic sensibility than with that of a prose writer. Prose tends to exclude space, poetry to incorporate it. So September California is giving us mixed message about literary form. Is this a poem? Is it a short story? Can it really be considered either? Yet to help us respond to a text, we tend to rely on establishing what kind of writing we're dealing with. That knowledge guides our understanding and appreciation, and these become part of the text's meaning for us. Here, we get ambiguous signals that compromise that meaning. Brautigan's book has promised us an apple, but handed us something that seems part apple, part pear. Of course, we should just enjoy it for what it is, but it's easy to treat it as a failed apple or a failed pear. Another way in which Brautigan fragments meaning is through his approach to metaphoric language, and here's an example in a poem called Crab Cigar. I was watching a lot of crabs eating in the tide pools of the Pacific a few days ago. When I say a lot, I mean hundreds of crabs. They eat like cigars. That's the whole poem. Another fragment, 7 lines, 33 words. And for the first 29 of those words, it's straightforward, prose-like even, although displayed as a poem, and at best, unexceptional. Then comes the sucker punch. They eat like cigars. Those final 4 words knock the whole poem's senses and simultaneously jump-start it into life. Do crabs eat like cigars? Do they look like cigars? Do cigars eat? If they did, how would they do it? And in what sense would it resemble the way the crabs eat? Metaphors and similes are meant to make meaning clearer. In a typical Brautigan comparison, it's difficult or impossible to make any rational meaning. In this case, as it happens, I think it is just possible to make precarious sense of the simile. In old cartoons, one way to represent a tycoon would be to draw somebody fat-faced with greedy, bulging eyes and a cigar jutting from the side of the mouth. A face you might associate with a toad or a crab. Maybe Brautigan had that likeness in mind, but with a typical act of omission, entirely removed the image of the cigar-chomping tycoon, leaving us with just the cigar. Whether or not that interpretation has merit, it's certainly difficult to reconcile the twin images of cigar and crab. You respond to the simile, as with most Brautigan comparisons, not because it neatly connects related phenomena, but because it mischievously wrenches together images that seem totally unrelated. This stands the whole concept of metaphoric language on its head. Yet just as the Greek fragments resonate through the loss of their original meaning, so does a Brautigan metaphor resonate through its buccaneering glee in making meaning hard to come by. That final sentence of Crab's cigar is a surreal, disruptive intrusion that turns a slight piece into something mysterious, unsettling, fascinating. Here's another short poem called Kafka's Hat, which has some similarly unexpected comparisons. With the rain falling surgically against the roof, I ate a dish of ice cream that looked like Kafka's hat. It was a dish of ice cream tasting like an operating table with the patient staring up at the ceiling. I actually went to the trouble of checking out photographs of Franz Kafka wearing hats. And yes, there is a characteristic hat. And yes, I can imagine a bowl of ice cream that might resemble such a hat. But of course, the type of hat is only indirectly relevant. The point is that it's Kafka's hat. And the title of the poem is Kafka's Hat. And we all know what can happen in the world of Kafka and his hat. Anything. Strangers can arrive at your door and accuse you of unspecified crimes. You can wake up one morning and find that you've turned into an insect. And you could find that a dish of ice cream tastes like an operating table with the patient staring up at the ceiling. Our sense of things is fragmented. The structures of normality we've relied upon have fallen. You can be walking along, minding your own business, looking at a load of crabs on the beach, and suddenly they're all eating like cigars. It's important to stress, however, that although conventional sense has been fractured, this is not a negative action, but a positive one. The strategies of disruption and fragmentation break things up only to make anew. They reclaim language as a medium of personal expression by ignoring or subverting predetermined conventions and notions of rationality. They also stress language as a pleasure in its own right. Kafka's hat is a pleasure. Its images resonate. And if we're puzzled, so what? As the American critic Stanley Fish tells us, ambiguity is there to be accepted and relished, not resolved. There's plenty of ambiguity in Brautigan, and bizarre comparisons, omissions and contradictions, the mixing of the everyday and the surreal, and these too are not puzzles to resolve, but textual treats to be enjoyed. Brautigan actually wrote many conventional pieces. Well, what makes him special? What should get him more academic applause than he's received? Are the many works in which he tries to reimagine what language and literature might be. Part of this reimagining follows, or is emboldened by, the example of the Greek fragments, as well as that of Kafka, Dada, and the Surrealists, among others. These help Brautigan to create a new aesthetic, one which strives not to make conventional sense, but to unmake it, or at least to disrupt it. He's not the first or the last to do that, but the way he does it has proved to be pretty much inimitable. It's a kind of magic, like finding an ancient remnant of text and seeing not an old poem in ruins, but a new and vibrant work of art. Thank you.
I loved hearing all of these excerpts you were reading, and I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you, Paul and Nadine. I want to address a little bit of this conversation that keeps coming up about the disappearance of Brautigan, and I'm kind of tired of the conversation, so I just want to, and usually when I talk about it, it irritates people what I have to say, so why not do it now? I feel like it's just, we're part of this culture. In the United States, we just want to duplicate Mother England, no disrespect, with this idea of literary canons and pedigree. Meanwhile, the U.S. American canon does not have a single Native American poet in it. So enough of this discussion of the canon. But also, we really need to be practical about this conversation about Brautigan. Because if you're dealing, and by the way, these people who create and maintain the canon, they're really not writers. They don't have the magic. They're just the literary administrators, the academics. And if I sound dismissive, it's because I am. And I'm a little tired of it. But we have to live with their dictates. So when I think about this, especially in considering Brautigan, I like to think about the fact that there's a location, a place, and time with his work that needs to be considered in this conversation. For instance, there is a group of poets in the San Francisco Bay Area called the Activists. Back in the 40s and the early 50s, they considered themselves to be the true inheritors of modernism. And maybe they were. And they were very much in line with this idea of the canon and where it's going, and they were the next. What they didn't see coming was the San Francisco Renaissance and the Beats. And once they arrived, it was a wall they could no longer penetrate. W.H. Auden chose their head writer of the activists, Rosalie Moore. He chose her extraordinary book, The Grasshoppers Man, for the 1949 Yale Sanger series of younger poets. It's one of my favorite books of poetry of all time. I don't believe that Brautigan's going to disappear any more than the activists, any more than Rosalie Moore were. And I can guarantee you that the activists were very bitter when the San Francisco Renaissance began. And Spicer and, everybody's in Bolinas with all these great writers. But it's not about disappearance. I believe very strongly that Brautigan is not a good writer. He's a great writer. And nothing can take that away. I wanted to also focus on the fact that, I'm not going to get into that. I'll just say it. I think the thing that we really need to be waiting for are his detractors to die. I know that sounds mean, but we all have to die. And once they die, I believe that there will be less opportunity in the literary circles, in academia, et cetera, to suppress him. I believe that there is a bit of suppression going on, especially considering people naysaying things like surrealism. We've been caught in the past 30 years in this culture, especially in experimental writing in the United States, with being lorded over by the language poets. Now, language poets I have a lot of respect for, but they also, they're dilettantes. And they police the language in the universities across the country. And they like to tell people, surrealism You know, they like to follow that whole objectivist line that surrealism is for children. I had an ongoing correspondence with the poet Sid Corman in Japan when I was younger. And we would have these angry, he really liked writing to me because I just didn't listen to anything he said. I was like, why am I even writing to you? And he would back and say, you know, things like Brautigan, for instance. He'd be like, that's for children, and you need to leave that alone, and it's going to ruin your writing. And I would back, and then, of course, this is before email. So, like, the airmail from Kyoto, Japan, like, across the... It's this anger, and then he's sort of like, I guess he's living his life, and then I'm living my life, and then it arrives in Philadelphia, and then I'm angry because I'm reading it, and then I respond immediately, and I would share some of these letters with Jonathan Williams, one of the last living Black Mountain College poets, who would just be very dismissive about Sid Corman. In fact, let me just give you a quote. He said, this is in regard to the letter where I'm defending Brautigan, as a matter of fact, and surrealism. And Jonathan Williams says just one response to Sid Corman. He says, Sid Corman, one of those poets who wants you to write just like him, only not as well. Okay, so enough of that. It's great writing. We'll be lucky to even have a planet soon. So, like, let's, you know. I want to focus on this book, The Tokyo Montana Express. I love this book. It's my favorite book of his. I think it's a great American classic. It's been out of print for years. I can't stomach looking at Amazon.com because of the literary vulture capitalists selling these books for hundreds of dollars. They're such scum, these people. And I want this to come back in print so that younger people don't have to spend $300 on a paperback edition that originally cost whatever it cost. And do you know, all of a sudden I can't remember what it cost.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have the cost on here. But it's like...
It definitely wasn't $300 originally. I thoroughly enjoyed rereading this book. And you said you have the earlier edition. So there was a 1979 edition. There were only 500 copies of, and there were fewer pieces in that, right? And then this is the trade paperback. There are 131 stories, I say in quotations, because I do believe that Brautigan was a poet, no matter what he was writing. I believe he was probably a poet just standing still breathing. So, but I had this about a month ago. I was hanging out with my amazing dear friend Joshua Beckman in La Push, and he saw this. He's like, are you reading that book, that Brautigan book? I said, yeah, and I explained about the conference. And we took the book down to the beach and started reading it out loud together. And it was the first time I'd ever read this book out loud, and I realized just how much was missing from not doing that for years. The thing that I really love and cherish about this book is Brautigan's conversation with and about death. This book came out about 4 years before he passed away. And you can see that this was a topic, well, I think it was always a topic, like all great writers had. But Brautigan's ideas of death the magic of this book is the way he talks about, the way he brings death alive. Let me just see, I have these portions that I wanted to, I know I can't possibly talk about all of the pieces because I only have a little bit of time, but the book begins with letters from Joseph Frankel, who is this Czechoslovakian musician traveling across Montana. And, well, not just Montana, but the West. And coming across a corpse half eaten by wolves. And then there are these, like, wrenching letters sent to his wife. And so it was just immediately you're steeped in this haunting idea of death. Brautigan, I think, loves to open the book with this idea of this musician, this classical musician from Czechoslovakia, wanting to dig for gold. But what he winds up finding, he doesn't find any gold. What he finds a lot of death. And so this comes up. when I think about this book, I think about E.M. Forster's book, Howard's End. He has this line in the book where he says, "Death destroys a man, but the idea of death saves him." And I think that that's the thing about this book that excites me the most. I would like to, let's see, I want to share, there's a piece in here I want to read. Let's see, a couple pieces, but I'm going to read this one. This is, never mind. I'll let you just hear it for yourself. You'll hear exactly what I mean by what I was saying about death. Winter vacation. Driving to town, the graves have turned to powdered wind and swirl gently across the road in front of us. But it's nothing to be afraid of. It's just a typical Montana winter day, passing the cemetery whose only punctuation are bunches of plastic flowers sticking out of the snow. The cemetery is one of the modern kind, without tombstones or crosses, designed for efficiency like a refrigerator. It has flat metal markers planted in the ground, so the only evidence of the graves is the plastic flowers and powdered wind blowing off the graves and caressing the road. A wind down from the mountains has allowed the graves to escape their solemn moorings. Driving by, I think the graves are almost frolicking, glad to be free of their anchors, ports of entry, sailing schedules, and silent cargo. The graves are free this winter day, happy. Let me just refer to these notes again. So you go, what I also love about the book is that you're going between Tokyo and Montana, literally. It's such a bizarre place to enter when you go into this book. One of my favorite pieces, I'm not going to read it because it's a little too long, it's called A Shrine of Carp. Probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. And I'm not going to read it because you have to find it and read it out loud, as it turns out. That takes place in Tokyo. I don't want to ruin it for you. That it's so magical that I want you to find it. Then there you go right from this Czechoslovakian musician and these like very dated letters that to put you in a time in the United States that people don't write letters like that anymore. And then you go directly into this very short, beautiful prose poem where a young woman is looking at her palm, and she's discovered from a palm reader that her lifeline is short. And it's this whole idea of the death coming. And she just says, "Damn it," like 4 or 5 times. She's like, "Damn it!" She's staring at her palm. And you can feel him in this piece, realizing just how short things are. And I feel like Brautigan is definitely one of the, I don't want to say think, I want to say feel. I feel like he's one of the writers who really understands that the magic of this world requires our participation. And I think you can get that very clearly in this book. Oh, sorry, my notes are really... I just had a lot of examples of other death in it. I don't want to get into that. But I would like to read one more piece in here. It's called The Window. And this is a perfect example of how this book operates with death in this sort of magic realism way. But it's not quite. It's just unlike the border of magic realism. This idea of things disappearing and then reappearing. It's sort of his own version of reincarnation, in a way, of the daily reincarnation. The Window. I shouldn't mistreat this book. It's worth $300. Like a kitchen window steaming up on a very cold morning, and it's hard to see out of. Then the steam slowly disappears, and you can see the snow-covered mountains, 10,000 feet high, out the window, And then the window gradually steams up again. Coffee on the stove, and the mountains gone like a dream. That's how I feel this morning. Actually, do I have time to read Shrine of Carp? Or should I stop there? I'll stop. Oh, can I? Oh, do you mind if I read Shrine of Carp? I wasn't going to, so I don't have it marked. Just give me 1 second. All of a sudden, I'm like, maybe I should read it. I don't know, maybe I can't find it. There are 131 titles. Maybe not. Maybe we're not supposed to. Thank you. Oh, yes. It's called the Tokyo Montana Express. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's not that long. It's a little longer than the other pieces I read. Shrine of Carp. And I love, too, how at the top of each little prose poem there's a train. It's like a coin. The bars are closing in Shibuya on a Friday night, and thousands of people are pouring out into the streets like happy drunken toothpaste, laughing and speaking Japanese. The traffic is very heavy with full taxis. It is well known that Shibuya can be a very difficult place to get a taxi cab on a Friday or Saturday night. Sometimes it can be almost impossible. Only fate and the direct intervention of the gods will secure you a taxi cab. I stand there in Shibuya in the middle of this gigantic party of Japanese. I feel no anxiety to go home because I am alone. When I get home, an empty bed in a hotel room waits for me, like a bridge to a lonely and solitary sleep. So I just stand there as peaceful as a banana, because that's what I look like in this all-Japanese crowd. Every taxi that comes by me is full, and the traffic is barely moving. Ahead of me, I can see empty cabs, but they are seized instantly as soon as they appear. I don't care. I'm not really going any place that counts. Not like the many young lovers that I see around me who are on their way to happy, drunken fucking. Let them have the cabs. They are a blessing from me to them. I was once young myself. Then I see an empty cab headed toward me, and for some strange reason, all the lovers look away, and I automatically raise my hand, beckoning toward the cab. It is not that I want the cab. It's just done out of unconscious habit. I have no interest in stealing their cab. When a person feels like that, of course, the taxi stops and I get into it. Kindness can only go so far. It is the privately owned cab because its interior reflects the personality of the cab driver and shows the professional pride he takes in owning his own cab. I tell the driver in Japanese where I'm going, and we start on our way. Still surprised by the cab stopping, it takes me a minute or so to become totally aware of the contents of the cab. When I get in, I can see that something is very unusual about the cab, far beyond the obvious personality touches that driver-owned cabs have. Then, as they say, it dawns on me in the bar-closing traffic of Shibuya where I am actually at. I am not in a taxi cab. I am in a Shrine of Carp. The taxi is filled with drawings, photographs, and even paintings of carp. In the back seat, there are 2 gold-framed paintings of carp. One of them is beside each door. Carp are swimming everywhere in the taxi. Carp, I say in English to the driver, hoping that means something to him. I don't know the Japanese word for carp. Hi, he says in Japanese, which means yes. Then I have a feeling that he knows the word for carp in every language on this earth, even in Eskimo, where there are no carp, only icebergs and such. The man really likes carp. I take a good look at him, He's a happy and jovial man. I remember that carp stands for good luck in Japanese, and I am in a moving Shrine of Carp, going in and out of the Japanese love traffic. It all makes sense. I see young lovers in cabs all around us on their way to pleasure and passion. We are swimming among them like good luck.
That was amazing. So we have time for a few questions, yes? Is that correct? And before we head into this question part, I just want to say I was that poor kid who read that poem and then became a poet and decided to become a professor who teaches Richard Brautigan all the time. And one of my main agendas is to inject this shit into academia and to change the canon. So I like really appreciate what everybody said. Yeah, that was like the real deal right there. And I love that. I use that poem, the Xerox Candy Bar, all the time to anyone that says poetry is not my thing and it's so confusing and hard and I just don't get it. And I'm like, how about this one? So I'm gonna walk around with this microphone to people so that you can be picked up, your question can be heard by everyone and for the cameras. Okay, we've got one over here.
Hi, I had a question. There was a name. People always mention, Brautigan's contemporaries, the famous San Francisco beats. Both Dr. Tanner and Mr. Conrad briefly mentioned the name of Jack Spicer. And I don't know if people are familiar with Spicer's work, but Spicer really was an influence on Brautigan. When he was a very young man, Spicer's writing workshops in San Francisco were the first ones that Brautigan attended. And was actually sort of recognized by Spicer as being a promising young poet. And Spicer actually helped edit and helped get trout fishing published at Evergreen Press. So I guess my question for Dr. Tanner and Conrad, has there ever been a serious study of the influence on Spicer's poetics on Brautigan's work? And is Spicer an influence on your poetry, CA, or yours, Tod, or yours, Mr. Tanner?
Good question.
Yeah, the self-serving answer is that there's an excellent discussion of Spicer's influence in my book. Landscapes of Language, available from all capitalist, monopolist, online suppliers.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but I also don't. I'm not. I understand why you're asking that, and it's important to mention who knew whom. But I don't want to ever take away from Brautigan by saying his influences, which I do believe that Billy Collins kind of did, in that I'm just going to say it, that annoying introduction he wrote for Trout Fishing in America, the anniversary edition. I'm not a fan of Billy Collins. I think he's a misogynistic, homophobic pig. But frankly, I believe that, yeah, Spicer did have a lot of influence on me. How could he not? I mean, Spicer was just so charismatic and extraordinary. But Brautigan wrote Brautigan in the end. And that's what I'm going to say.
Just to add on to that too, I think that one of the main huge differences from a more academic perspective between their work is puns versus metaphor, and the way that Brautigan's metaphors were being talked about is like they land these punches at the end that completely throw the poem into like a little bit of chaos or confusion, and in that something opens up, something that Spicer would have done with puns. With far less immediacy and impact, in my opinion. Another question, anyone? I feel like I'm a game show host right now. Come on down.
I don't know if you can hear my question. Can anyone hear me? I wanted to ask Ms. Brautigan about the the childhood in Tacoma because I was so interested to see this large biography appear. And where did Richard Brautigan go to his primary school years in Tacoma? I wondered. It was unclear to me in the biography.
This is a really good question. I don't know. But I'm sure it could be tracked down. I mean, someone would have to do that research. Gatz has passed, and if he was here now, he would be like, oh my God, more work. But no, that's a really good question. I was able to follow with my memoir. I went and sat on the floor it's actually a really nice room, in the right near here in the city hall, and pulled out all these city directories and was able to track everybody where they moved, which was, so that was interesting to me. But I don't know. My father didn't talk a lot about his childhood, and when he did, it was pretty gruesome. So, but he spent a lot of time walking around Tacoma. I know that he was afraid of, are there statues here? Where are the statues in Tacoma? Are there a couple statues here? Yeah, are they people though? People? Okay, he was really scared of those statues, because he told me he thought they were real. He wrote a beautiful story about going on a picnic to Mount Rainier, and it's a story, I think it's called Christopher Columbus. It's a story that he would tell me. It was his version of reading to your child. He would tell the story from his childhood over and over to me when I was little, before I went to bed, and it was a very short story. It was just he goes up to Mount Rainier and has a picnic and cooks flowers as burgers. But that's a really good question. I hopefully someone will write another biography someday, because I would love to find out more. Just knowing where. I know he didn't learn to read till he was 6. I think that's in Tokyo Montana Express, is it? It's something first grade. He talks about something about first grade learning to read. But anyway, so I hope that answers your question.
His mother, and he lived in a funeral home. They lived in a funeral home apartment just for a little while. And the understanding I have is that funeral building that still stands along Tacoma Avenue across from Central Grade School. Well, I understand that was the people who owned that cemetery, that funeral home, belong to the church that I attend, and they only recently stopped having the business, which had been. I understand whether people talk to me about it, knowing and being familiar with that, or whether I read it from the biography. I'm not certain, but my family had funerals at that funeral home, as did so many people.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. One more question? Anyone? All right, looks like we can wrap it up. Thank you to our panelists